Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to At Family Office. And for my members of SFO Continuity, welcome members of my SFO Continuity. Today, elite family office strategies, advanced compensation techniques to build winning teams. As family office leaders, we all know that talent is everything. The success of your family office hinges upon hiring, empowering, and retaining the best people. Those who not only understand your vision, but can help you execute it flawlessly. So today we're joined in a special session by Patrick McCurry, partner at McDermott Will Emery, a renowned family office attorney, as he shares very powerful insights into designing compensation packages that attract and retain the right people. I've always said the best family offices do one thing brilliantly. They hire the right people. If I had to add to that, they empower and incentivize them and retain them. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Angelo. Great. Thanks for having me.
I like to start with a little bit of a write-up I did in 2015. It could be updated. We could include the two folks, Glenn and I'm forgetting John, who kind of were active in MSD Capital back in the day. But because I am old, I'm going to go with a really old school example, and that is Sid Bass hiring Richard Rainwater. So I spoke about the premise of that as I remember it. It's been about 9 years. I believe a young Richard Rainwater was 26 at Goldman. Sid Bass identified him as being exceptional and had the opportunity to onboard him with the opportunity of sharing in the profits of what they would invest in. And eventually Richard having an opportunity to go out, of course, on his own. And that created, obviously, a billionaire when a billion was a real billion, Patrick, like 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
So the gold parachute for executives that are talented at investing is, could they be that next Richard Rainwater? Now, we could argue that maybe is one of a million, but we could dream, or you could at least aspire to a high level. So why don't I start with, as we build a little bit in the compensation, what qualities make an individual an A-level talent in the first place? I understand you're not a recruiter, but you know so many billion, multi-billion dollar, decabillionaire families, you kind of see some patterns and things you identify.
I do. And I will say, obviously, I'm not an investment person, so I will bracket sort of their specific acumen in invest and maybe speak more broadly about sort of character traits. Let's assume that there's just a baseline intellectual acumen and experience in, let's say, the investment area, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about this. We're seeing more and more, incentive equity plans for general counsels and tax directors and things that are not just investment professionals as well. But to me, I think the number one that I see that I really resonate with are people that understand and want to execute the family's vision. So it's not their vision necessarily. It's trying to understand what their principals really want and being totally committed to that, even when it might not be in their own economic interest. So it's this like really singular dedication to the family's best interest that I think is the number one thing. The number two thing is probably just adaptability, because as you know, family offices are very bespoke, unique. I mean, some of them behave more like an Aries or an Apollo than others, but a lot of my clients are just they have different deal networks and deal flow, and sometimes they're dealing with family dynamics and personal issues. It's not all just doing deals. It's a family system. And I think the ability to kind of adapt and have emotional intelligence beyond just sort of intellectual or legal or whatever the practical skill set is, I think is really important. And then, being a great communicator of complex ideas means sometimes the principals themselves, run a private equity fund and so are very sophisticated, but sometimes, your principals are third or fourth generational people that don't have deep investment backgrounds, and the ability to kind of like boil down complex ideas to simple, straightforward language, I think is really central to someone being successful, maybe anywhere. But I think in family offices in particular, when you're sometimes dealing with family members and other advisors that don't always speak your language, the ability to translate and boil down things, I think is really important.
How can family offices compete with larger institutions? Imagine banks, hedge funds, private equity firms, in your world, large legal and or accounting firms. What would make them attractive compared to a traditional organization, like I mentioned, that honestly probably has deeper pockets?
Right. Yeah, let's kind of assume that the compensation may be slightly under for a second. I mean, obviously, if it's over where they're coming from, then it's probably a no-brainer. But the things that family offices bring that an institutional fund, for example, may not, is an incredible amount of flexibility and to be part of building something that's special and unique, I think. So autonomy, flexibility, lack of red tape in many ways, the ability to have direct contact with decision makers and not go through a bunch of committees, the network, that it's just interesting. And I think a lot of people, and maybe I'm oversimplifying, but in my experience, money is really important and being economically incentivized is really important. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings trying to live our lives and be happy and be balanced. And I do think a lot of family offices, well executed, can bring a level of balance and humanity and just some fun, right? Like sometimes your principal's on a sports team and there's a lot of perks, or there can be a lot of perks that are not necessarily present in more traditional institutional investor scenarios. So yeah, I think you've got to be able to compete at some level. It can't be apples and oranges, I think, with like an institutional fund in terms of base compensation. But I think a lot of people want more than that. And they want to be able to be part of something that they feel that they're building. And I think some of the best people that I know, that's their best quality, is that they're builders. And they want to be associated with builders, and they don't want to be stuck in an institution where there's a lot of red tape and maybe not the ability to execute without going through levels of committees and approvals and things like that I think can be more frustrating. Now, some private equity or venture funds are much more nimble than others. Obviously, those are not all cut from the same cloth, but I do think the right family office is incredibly flexible and dynamic, and I think can be very rewarding for the right person and very lucrative. I mean, I know of many, many family office executives that have become themselves sort of capable of having their own family offices just from long tenure of sticking with a family for decades and doing well by them and with them. And I think you can also do very well financially when you're aligned with a family and, everyone's on the same page in terms of the economics.
Now, Patrick, I'm not used to this. Usually I'm the extreme advocate of the single family office. So I'm going to wear a little bit of the bad boy hat for a second.
Sure.
And take a little bit of the other perspective. Of course, I agree with you, but it's complex. There's nuances because every family and family office is different. Could I also make the argument on the other side of the fence that one, family offices could absolutely be overly hierarchical and bureaucratic and be every bit as slow as institutions? Why don't I even call that, in my opinion, 30 to 40% of most multi-billion-dollar SFOs, especially if the founding principal is no longer around, because they're usually like that. That's one issue. But the bigger issue that I'm going to, I suppose, bring up is the area of, okay, I land this wonderful position. I have a wonderful agreement. The principal, I mean, let's be honest, is usually, if it's a founder in their 60s or 70s, I don't know that they're going to live forever. So
Oh,
what happens when the the patriarch or matriarch spouse, the rising generation, is not overly engaged and damn with agreements, we're richer than you.
right.
The now founder or one that really built the family office is incapacitated or dead, which is
Right.
more likely to happen as they get every year older, let's just be honest. And what happens with, as opposed to a private equity, unless it's really one prominent
Sure.
founder or a bank, there's layers of governance and structure where it
Yeah.
continues. That's not always the case in the family office.
Almost never the case. Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably, I actually think that's probably the single biggest risk to joining a single family office is I don't know what you want to call that, principal risk or something like that, where the person that, or people that you are hiring into, whether that's an existing executive team or a generation or a principal or whatever, they could change on a dime, or right, like you said, the principal could die or become disabled. And then the next generation wants to build something their own, and they think of the system as dad or mom's people. And that's the thing that makes me nervous about maybe why I like kind of being on the outside a little bit, because I don't have that same principal risk. And I do in a smaller, more diversified way. But I do think if family people are considering leaving an institution where there's continuity and stability and maybe a bunch of red tape around that, but I do think you have to be very comfortable with not just your direct report or principal, but what is the succession plan here? And we deal with that in documents. We'll say, we almost treat the death or incapacity of the principal as like a special event that might trigger severance or a put option or something like that on co-invest. So like we actually deal with that a lot on the front end of some of these arrangements, because I think intelligent people, they see that risk and they're willing to assume it because of the other things. But I actually do think there's not an easy way to solve for that. You try your best, right? But like that is a risk of a single family office for sure. And I don't know what you can do about it, because if it becomes more institutional, then you've lost some of the charm or benefit. And that's what I said. Some of our clients are more just like another institutional, fund in terms of just it's run by professionals. The family is maybe overseeing, but they're not day to day, and they essentially are almost indistinguishable from, Aries. But that's an exception still to my rule. And most of our clients do not operate like those institutions.
Another point that I would bring up that maybe is a little contrarian for most people as extreme advocates in the single family office community is, and this is more of a recruiter type question, I get it, but I'm still going to ask it to you, of course. I see a lot of people, I'm looking for someone who's going to be with us forever, who's going to be with us decade after decade. And that's integral in terms of what we're hiring. I get it, because trust is everything, ethics and character, knowing where the bodies are buried, and that I could trust someone the more years they're with us to know our nuances. I'm not disrespectful of that. I understand it, but I have a little bit of a problem with it. So you're kind of implying to me that ahead of raw intelligence, and ahead of applying your capability, ahead of being top 1% of what you're due, is that I need you to at least have a handshake. You're going to be with me a long, long time.
Yeah.
Like, it's a little bit like a sports analogy. If I'm Bill Belichick and I'm a great coach, I'm probably going to have coaches below me plucked. Now, the reality is a lot of them haven't really done that good, but that's a different story. I should almost be happy that we have such an incredible reputation that we always need to keep the roster kind of filled up to the top of the glass. So I'm more of an advocate. I rather have you be incredible, but maybe you're only with me for 3 or 4 years versus you're okay and you're going to be with me for decades. Am I that wrong?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think I think you're right. And I do think it's oversimplified and maybe misguided to assume that the right move is someone that's willing to stick with you. Maybe their ability to stick with you is a negative attribute of theirs. And we, it's funny you bring that up. I mean, McDermott, we have this relatively new concept that we've started to embrace. Like, we're okay being a career accelerant, meaning if someone's at McDermott for 5 years and rocking and rolling and they want to do something, in their mind bigger and better, like, we support that. We hopefully keep them in our network and then they become clients or, like, I do think you're right to
That's
embrace.
a good way to look at it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like to me, here's the reality. It's a small world. It's a really small world in this world, the SFO world. And it's not just about not burning bridges, but I think that if you had some superstar 27-year-old that put in 5 great years with you and then went off to spin out and raise a fund or go somewhere else or go to another family, I mean, that shouldn't be seen as a negative. I mean, what you do need is some type of continuity. So maybe it's that the person at the top of the stack has been there forever, right? But you live, as you said, I think it was a good idea. Like, if Belichick was turning over every 3 years, that's a problem. But to be a career accelerator and accelerant to talent and to attract people knowing maybe that they may not be there for 10 years, maybe that is a good thing. And I think you just have to look at what the needs are, what the goals are, and make it work. But I agree with you that I think that sometimes is a cliche to say, oh yeah, like, you need to be with us forever. That's not, I think that's going to reduce your chances of getting someone that might be so good for you for 5 or 7 years or 3 to 5 years at the cost of some type of preconceived notion of continuity. And so I agree with you on that. I mean, obviously it's nice to have people, and sometimes you see incredible talent stay for decades and hook their wagon. But I think you are seeing more movement just generally in the labor market, and as younger generations, they're just not thinking, oh, I'm going to punch the clock at IBM for 30 years and then get my clock and retire. Like, that's not how some of the best and brightest think. They think of what's the next opportunity.
And on it, really hardcore direct investing professionals, sometimes you become allocated to the brim after 3 or 4 years, and there's not as much opportunity. And honestly, that person may need to move on to maybe a deca-billionaire family that has a lot of money to allocate. And maybe there's ways you could develop co-investing opportunities and other things with them. I am a believer, and it's sometimes why I get my hate from the community, because I'm a little bit of a different thinker. I actually think that superstars are underrated. And I'm going to use a sports analogy again. When Edmonton traded Wayne Gretzky to LA and they got 6 good or whatever it was players back, that doesn't equal one Wayne Gretzky. Trading Michael Jordan in his prime for 3 or 4 good players that aggregate statistics equal Michael Jordan is not the one Michael Jordan. I'm a believer that superstars are underrated. Now, on the investment front, might that come with ego? Might that come with going a little bit outside the traditional etiquette of how our family office operates? And that's a decision that the principal in the family office is going to have to make. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's more complicated than how it appears on the surface. And if you have an opportunity to bring on someone who is inherently gifted, like and they have an upcoming track record, I don't see how you could pass that over. But that's just me.
Yeah, but I think maybe a key to this whole puzzle is just trying to be as transparent on both sides as possible around the expectation, right? Like, where it's hard is you thought that the principal thought that this person was going to be there forever, but the individual thought, oh, this is a 3-year, stepping stone. And I know that sometimes we live in our own delusion, but ideally you have some conversations about, look, what do you want? What's your long-term, midterm, short, and maybe you come in with this idea. This is how a lot of institutional investors work, is everybody knows the person's going to be there for a couple years and then do their MBA, and that's okay. But it's really about expectation management and just being transparent and open and honest, I think, on both sides of what people are looking for. so that it's not some big disruptive surprise. But I think sometimes it's hard because you don't want to admit, you don't want to hire someone knowing that they're going to leave you. It's just a human thing, right?
Of course. Well, now, Patrick, we're really getting into it. The family office advantage on the surface is they could play over decades. When you play in decades, I could argue, and to some degree, you have no competition. Now, here's the rub. When you're the non-bloodline executive, you probably don't have decades to balance out the compensation on direct investments with exits in private companies that may take decades to play out. And henceforth, this is where you get paid as an attorney in many ways. How do you help negotiate this and make the family realize they may need to get creative on compensation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, very specific example that I kind of call like bridging the holding period gap or something, where there's just different time horizons for wealth and liquidity. And just to give a very specific example on how we often solve for that is you've got a co-invest program where the individual is co-investing and is, 3 or 5% of the deal, but the family controls the exit. And like you said, I mean, it literally could be a 40 or 50-year asset. And so you just have a conversation and you say, well, why don't we do this? Like maybe in 10 years, we will give the employee a partial or a complete put option on their co-invest at fair market value. And we'll talk about how we're going to value the company at that point. And we'll generate sort of an artificial liquidity event where the family is the source of the liquidity rather than a third-party buyer. And it just is that's a very common way to sort of solve for that holding period problem because, I mean, sometimes the family will say, well, we don't have liquidity, and so you shouldn't either. But I think when you're not a decabillionaire and you have mouths to feed, I mean, the idea that, well, maybe your descendants might realize this direct investment is not really a thing. So you've got to bridge that. And usually we bridge it through some type of put option. And it just sort of makes sense. And then you sort of have a discussion around when that happens, how many times, partial or total. And then really the most important thing is how do you value it, right? Because you don't have a third-party transactions to say what it's worth. So, you figure out a metric, either a formula or some type of appraisal or something to value the company for purposes of exercising that put. But that's a very common thing. I mean, so that's usually the mechanic through which to sort of provide acceleration of liquidity on like a co-investor or a carry too. Because the holding period problem is the same either way. If the family never sells, the carry or a co-invest never liquidates. And so we'll see a put option on either carry and or co-invest often.
I'm going to read a quote from billionaire and someone who literally created multiple billion-dollar companies. A great entrepreneur, his name is Brad Jacobs. Compensation is the most effective tool I have to motivate employees. If a candidate says to me, I'm not motivated by money, I suspect either they're not being candid or honestly, they lack a sense of hunger that is necessary to succeed in the world of business and a profit-driven enterprise. I admit a single family office is unique. That's not a perfect apples to apples. It's apples to oranges. I'm more in the camp of Brad that I actually want someone who is not going to a family office to wrap up the last 3 to 5 years of their career, not looking to coast into comfort. And we hinted at this earlier. I rather have excellence for even if it's relatively a briefer amount of time. This then segues into more advanced strategies of compensation negotiation, carried interest, co-investment, and effectively synthetic or phantom equity, if we could break down each one.
Sure. Yeah, and just as an aside, I totally agree that hunger and drive is not easy to teach and maybe is just either intrinsic or not. And if somebody has hunger and drive and I think are also oriented in the right way with integrity and the best interest of the family, that's lights out, right? because someone could be not driven and be a great person and be oriented towards the family, and that doesn't do much good. Or someone could be this hard charging, greedy individual, but that's not oriented in the right way, and that comes up with conflicts and presenting deals a certain way. I mean, there's all sorts of problems. That's why I said the most important thing to me is proper orientation vis-a-vis your client, or the principal of the family. But once you have that, there's no replacement for hunger and chips on your shoulder, and I love that. That they say chips in shoulders, but chips in pockets, and I agree with that completely. So yeah, I like to hear people's stories that maybe they didn't grow up with wealth, or not everyone who did doesn't have drive, but oftentimes people that struggled through and have grit are some of the most successful people in reality. So anyway, so I just wanted to second that emotion because I'm a big fan of grit and drive, and it's irreplaceable, really. So on the different strategies, yeah, I'll just start, if it's okay, with just like a brief overview. I don't mean to be pedantic if most people understand this, but I'll start with just an explanation of what these three, let's say 4 strategies are, and then we can dig deeper. But I'd say probably the most common, because it acknowledges that oftentimes the individual doesn't have their own large independent wealth to do a lot of co-investing, is carry. So carry is when you give somebody a share of the upside in an asset or a group of assets in the form of interest in a partnership. So there's a tax benefit. It oftentimes, results in capital gain treatment versus ordinary income. So it's tax efficient, and it allows someone to get a share of the upside. That can be in a single asset. So if somebody's doing direct deals, sometimes that carry is deal by deal. Sometimes it's more of like a vintage structure or fund structure where, oftentimes families are interested in what they call cross-collateralization. Like they don't want to have a 2x over here and a 0 over here and pay carry when the family's net negative or break even. So sometimes you have even, carry, you have sort of commingling across vintages or asset classes or whatever. But, that's tax efficient for both the family and for the employee. And the reason why it's tax efficient for the family is because it's sort of a synthetic tax deduction, because you're actually allocating gain away from the family members and trust to that individual. So it's basically synthetically deductible. And then oftentimes it is capital gain. So employees really like that because, if you pay phantom comp or something, that's all ordinary income at ordinary rates. You can also use the pass-through entity tax deduction to deduct essentially state income taxes on the employee's share of carry, which is another benefit to any equity-based structure as opposed to traditional W-2 comp. So carry is very, very common. The downside, no pun intended, to carry, as we've talked about in the past, is that there's no perceived or potentially downside. There's no skin in the game. Right. So the fear, and I don't know that this is always true, but the fear is if someone only participates in the upside, they might not be measuring risk in a way that's aligned with the family that's funding it, because they don't get taken. They don't have to come out of pocket if the assets go down in value, and they share in the upside. So there's a perception sometimes that might not have complete alignment. Because they don't feel the burn of a loser. So that leads us to the next structure, which is often not as an alternative to, but in addition to carry, which is co-invest. And that's when the employees are putting their own dollars in the deals. And the 2 forms of co-invest would be just traditional unlevered co-invest, meaning they're just coming out of pocket. The more typical co-invest, I think, is actually a leveraged co-invest, meaning for every dollar, let's say, that the employee puts in the investment, the family will loan them $2, $3, $4, something like that, which is a way to sort of supercharge their exposure, but acknowledges that they don't have maybe the liquidity to put millions in. But if they can put in 500 grand and borrow $1 million, they'll get the economic exposure of $1.5 million, and the downside risk of the $1.5 million, but the family's providing them the liquidity in the form of a loan to sort of supercharge their out-of-pocket investment. So I'm a big fan of leveraged co-invest because I think it acknowledges the disparate liquidity profiles that are often the case here, but it allows somebody to get real exposure. And usually we structure, not to get too nerdy and technical, but there's different ways to structure those loans. Like sometimes they're partially recourse, meaning if the assets go to zero, they're not at risk, they're not out of pocket. But normally we structure those as recourse debt because if you don't, there's not really downside. It more is like an option. And there's actually a Treasury regulation that says that a full recourse loan is exempt from the carried interest rules for tax purposes. So it's the only absolutely clear path to capital gain. There is a risk if you don't have a non-recourse debt to fund a co-invest, that there's a risk that this code section would apply to recast long-term gain into short-term gain, which would be bad, as we say, technically. But that's a whole nother topic we can talk about another time, is the application of the carried interest legislation to family offices, which is near and dear to my heart. But generally, a full recourse leverage co-invest is going to get you capital gain treatment on an exit, which is another reason why I think people use it. But, it doesn't acknowledge the effort that goes in. So, right, you're just sitting shoulder to shoulder. So that's why oftentimes co-invest is still partnered with some type of carry to acknowledge all the efforts, not just the dollars, right? Because, getting access to deal is a benefit, but it doesn't really acknowledge all the work that goes into the diligence and execution and follow-up and et cetera. So sometimes you just see co-invest, sometimes you just see carry, but oftentimes when I'm working with a client, I'll sort of explain the benefit of both, and oftentimes you see a hybrid approach there, and you see both elements. And then I guess the last one is a phantom plan, which is basically W-2 compensation, but it tracks the performance of underlying investments. So you say, okay, instead of paying you a bonus this year, Angelo, we're going to put what would have been your bonus into a phantom account, and it's going to track the performance of these deals or this fund. And so it gives you tax deferral and ideally sort of tracks, it's sort of like a 401k, but it's tracking to the family's investments rather than the public markets, for example. And that's another way it's simpler than the tax compliance of doing carry and co-invest, because you actually have to give people K1s, and there's state filings and international tax filings. And depending on the underlying investments, doing actual equity for people can get really complicated, just pure compliance wise. So sometimes families will go with a phantom plan, just for more simple execution. But because it's ordinary income to the employees,
that's the big drawback.
So sometimes we'll see a carry and co-invest for the executive teams, but then they'll use a phantom plan for more of the mid-level or junior folks that just, might be overly burdened by an equity structure, and the dollars just may not be big enough to merit a full equity structure for more junior people. So I have a lot of clients that have a phantom plan for other, certain people, and then they'll do maybe more of a carry or co-invest for more senior, both investment people and non-investment executives. But yeah, because the ordinary income thing is a real issue.
Oh no, that's real money at the likely type of income and capitals that we're talking about. I think another subject that is deemed to be swept under the rug a little bit around this subject that we're talking about is the honest reality of often a principal and agent problem. Let's just assume that I'm the principal, I created a company, and I'm still in it. Tend to be a little bit aggressive. I'm looking to conquer the world. But depending on my executive, their personality, and their compensation, they may follow the principle, which on the surface sounds good because Warren Buffett is so a great philosopher. Rule number 1, don't lose money. Rule number 2, remember rule number 1. I get it. That sounds good. And for some principles, that probably is the exact right decision if there's clarity. But I can also make the point that in roaring markets like the last 2 years, these big endowments bragging about getting 7 or 8%, they wickedly underperformed the S&P, the triple Q, the Mag 7. Oh, but we're less volatile on the downside. But if I'm a family looking decade after decade, I'll put up with an occasional, I think, minus 22% year for all the other values that the math tells me that I'm going to get over time. But if I'm a non-bloodline, if I'm an executive that's not bloodline to the family, I may be afraid of repercussions. I may be afraid of an investment board. And this is some of the reasons why you didn't see many overly structured family offices being active in Bitcoin, being more active in AI. They're a little bit enticed by it. They're afraid of the volatility, and they kind of don't know what they don't know. How do you help families honestly address the issue of what I deem to be a principal and agent problem?
Yeah, I think not to sidestep your question, but I guess as being not an investment person, because I think a lot of times there may be principal agent problems in other areas, but I think you're primarily talking about in the investment thesis, right? And
sure, yes.
And I just don't oftentimes am not a party to those deep conversations between, the CIOs and the principals on the core. I mean, I understand the problem you're sketching out very well. And I've seen it in real life where there's a total disconnect between the principal and the entire investment team. Like, for example, and it's not always that the principal wants to be aggressive. It can be the other way, right? It can be in any different way where the principal will have such wealth that they are fine just sitting in municipal bond. Like, they don't care. They're not trying to actually maximize the returns. That's not actually their objective. Their objective is to have enough money to fund an acquisition of a sports. Like, principals can do whatever they want. Like, they're not all endowment style structures. And so I do think all I can really say maybe about your question is it is a real problem, and I see the challenge of it. And the only way I know to try to solve for it is just to have as much transparency and open communications about, like, what are the goals of this thing and making sure that they're aligned. Because I guess in my world where, like, my clients are the family, they have to be served. And it's fine if you think that what you know is better than what they want to do. But that to me means that you don't do what they don't want you to do, you leave. Right? Like, I don't know that you can be in a world where there's a fundamental disconnect on the foundational investment thesis on both sides of that. That doesn't seem sustainable. And I agree, but that's why there's a market. It's not, right? I mean, that's like, but I do think it's often the case where spoken or unspoken, there's not alignment between the entire investment team and the principal. I mean, I have situations like that and it's hard. And I just say, hey, like, I'll talk to the principal and say, you've got to be really clear about what your goals and objectives are. You've got to articulate that. And then you've got to say, which is a hard conversation, if you don't want to do that, you should leave. Right. And I think even some of the most powerful principals, some of them don't like confrontation and they don't want to stir the pot, and they're content to the status quo, and that can become a hurdle. But at the end of the day, I mean, to me, this is the principal's money, and I think their goals and objectives have to be paramount. But sometimes they're not articulated, or they're not articulated clearly, or I mean, so anyway, I understand the problem. I don't know that I have a magic bullet, other than I do think transparency is always useful, and having sometimes difficult conversations to say, hey, like, I'm not sure what your vision is here. Like, if I'm the CIO, like, I think sometimes people don't want to be very open and honest with their principals because they're afraid of what they might think or do, or so you get into sometimes these like stagnating relationships that are dysfunctional.
All too common. Now, when we're talking about carried interest co-investment phantom, that's relatively obvious and straightforward for the investment professional in the family office, but that's often only one aspect of a true family office. There's legal, accounting, and other supporting and other professionals in general. It's a little more complicated then to how do you do advanced compensation structures when it's not as easy to tie into an investment performance?
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a lot of thoughts on that. That topic of using or when to use incentive equity for non-investment professionals. Here's my thought, not to rant too much, but two things are really driving that. One is a cultural decision and one is a market decision. So what I mean by that is I have seen all too often where sometimes the CFO or the general counsel is working just as hard on the deal, Angela, and maybe they didn't necessarily source it, but to say they didn't work on it, or maybe they didn't underwrite it, but they worked really hard on the deal. And then there's some big exit and the junior investment person gets all this money and the CFO and this general counsel or the tax person are sitting there and saying, yeah, what about us? And so I think culturally, it may not be the same exact structure or the same amount dollar amounts, but I'm a big fan of sort of sharing the wealth with non-investment people, just so you build a culture of team.
100%.
And sometimes, honestly, the legal issues that were flagged on diligence by the GC is just as important as the model or whatever that any investment banker could do. So I'm not dismissing investment acumen, but a deal and bringing something to fruition, it takes a village. And maybe it's because I'm a lawyer myself, but I do think rewarding and incentivizing non-investment people is so critical to building a really powerful culture of teamwork and fending off resentment and all that. The other fact is that talent, again, I'm curious what you think about this. Sometimes investment talent is easier to find than accounting or legal or tax, actually. And sometimes the tax people can save tens of millions of dollars through tax planning that the investment people are clawing to turn on a $5 million direct deal. So I think tax and legal and estate planning, things like that, are incredible assets and actually valuable economic assets of the family, where I don't know what I was talking about. Where it doesn't in the war for talent, especially with what's happening in the accounting practice and the flight from accounting, and if you have a top flight general counsel or tax person, that's gold. And the market may say, hey, so I think you're also just dealing with market compensation and alternatives, just like you are. And I am sometimes having to remind principals hey, your GC is gold. And I know you don't see it because you've only just known them, but I work with 200 single family offices. And I'm telling you right now, protect this person with your life. And don't pay your junior analyst on the investment team more than this person that's been with you for 20 years. And you got to get out of your head a little bit that this is a cost and that the investment team is an asset. So I think, and maybe if I had my own family office, you want everyone to feel like an asset rather than a cost, right? And I think you want to build alignment between the executors and the planners and the investment team. And I do think where compensation goes, you got totally different mismatched comp structures. You just see it's human nature to build resentment, right? And when there's resentment, then there's lack of teamwork, and where there's lack of teamwork, there's lack of coordination, and things are missed, and it can just get very messy, as opposed to bringing everybody under the tent, where everyone feels like they're on the same team and on the same page. That's really what you want. And I do think that non-investment talent is maybe harder to keep than investment talent. Maybe that's a scandalous claim, but I'm curious what you think about it.
Well, you are eating your own cooking there.
I'm eating my own cooking here.
But my experience of 20 years, I agree with you. I'm going to have a tough question coming up on that, but now you're going to be very modest, but you would fit that role as a family office liaison, an expert in what you do in legal. And I remember when I started almost 20 years ago, he's long since retired, so he could throw out his name. There was a guy in your backyard in Chicago, non-competing on legal and accounting. I'm telling you, audience, when you were a big family office and you had a real problem, especially accounting centric, do you remember Steve Thorne?
Absolutely. It's a Lloyd.
Yeah. That guy was brilliant. Like I had families that would, if they could squeeze in the 20 minutes of his schedule, they would fly out that morning just to go see him. Like he was like a legend.
Yes, absolutely.
So now here's the tough one. When it comes to investing, it's pretty easy to quantify. It's just math. When it comes to especially estate planning, I don't know until really after I'm dead. How do I know that you were either too conservative, that you took too many risks, that I'm going to get audited, I'm going to lose, I'm going to get a black mark? So sometimes legal and accounting is harder to quantify with mathematics and numbers. Henceforth, how do I know if my person's really good? Do I need someone like you as a non-conflicted, although I could argue if you're hired by the family, you might be conflicted, how you could be, do you almost need a second or third opinion on those kind of services?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I do think sometimes I am in a really good spot to help tell principals how good or sometimes not good their tax and legal teams are. And it's rough, but like, I'm very honest and my whole practice depends on my candor and integrity. So I do hopefully, am always very, very honest no matter what the message may be. But I do think that it is harder to quantify, but some things are very quantifiable, right? Like, I mean, this is not to go, I know you've talked on other podcasts about sort of the profits, interest, management company planning, but like there's certain income tax and estate planning that are quite quantifiable. Like if we didn't do this, we would have this assets, but if we do this tax planning, we have the investment returns on $5 million in income tax savings, and we've, let's say, cleared the statute of limitations, to use your example of like, well, how do we know where the risk ends? And, you can actually run models on tax alpha, structural alpha, and PPLI, and profits interest planning, and QSBS. And I mean, like, that's why as an income tax lawyer, I like my job so much, because a lot of what we do is pretty quantifiable and it's dollars and cents, as opposed to, succession and things that are harder to say, well, although estate planning and GST planning can be very quantified too. You can say, if we would have not done this or done that, like this would be the estate tax payable. Now it might be in 50 years. So you got to like present value it a little bit, but you can sort of run rough models on estate planning values and tax planning. And frankly, like the investment returns, how do you quantify that? Like, okay, yeah, we were 3x, but if you had just bought SPY, you'd be 3.5x. Right. So I just think people get a little bit too caught up in numbers on the investment side because it's so easy to quantify, but relative to what? And on tax, it's sort of like relative to inactivity. And so anyway, I agree with you, obviously, Angela. It's not as simple to see the value, but I do think if you talk to me or people that are in the space that have objectivity and see hundreds of different situations, like I will sometimes take a principal aside after a meeting and say, your CFO didn't tell me to tell you this, but I'm telling you, you have one of the best CFOs that I've ever worked with. And it's funny, their face will like light up because they don't know. And the CFO may be too humble to like promote themselves. They're just doing their job and they're doing a good job. But I do try to take the opportunity to call out excellence when I see it, because I know that people don't have the perspective, especially on legal and tax and accounting. it's sometimes hard to know whether you've got a superstar or not, because
Yes.
you're not an expert in what they're an expert in. And so you're kind of just trusting. So I do think maybe your point is right, which is that you do need validation from somewhere about whether someone's really good in an area that you don't even know the questions to ask, maybe as the principal.
Exactly.
So you're like, I don't know, this person's been here forever. They seem good, but you might not know, and you definitely don't know what you don't know or what they don't know. So that's why, like, working with outside advisors, I mean, that's never going to go anywhere. Just because we have the visibility that we have is just so broad, like Steve Thorne or people like that. I mean, we just see everything. So we're able to, I think, guide people to say, hey, this is what other people are doing as opposed to what you have done.
And you could argue, if you're not a monster, centimillionaire family, there's 17 of them according to the Forbes list. So I could be worth above 100 billion and not even be in the top 10. I got a long way to go, Patrick.
Yeah, you're getting there. You're getting there.
And by the way, to whet the audience's appetite, we'll have Patrick and other partners back talking about things this year, like buying professional sports teams, like PPLI. And although we're focused very much on compensation, as I mentioned, and Patrick's too modest now, he really is arguably the leading, but among the leading attorneys for family offices. When you think, and my audience will know what I'm talking about, when you think back to lender versus the IRS and all these complex structuring issues, Patrick really is one of the global authorities on it. So we're being very focused on compensation and a little bit around that, but we'll have other opportunities a little bit later in the year. A couple of questions I do have, and this relates a little bit to my Sid Bass, Richard Rainwater story. On the investing side, what happens or how do you negotiate when you just got a feeling, family office, you got a superstar here? I'm going to be honest with you. They probably want to be a billionaire. They're going to learn and work with you, but they're probably going to look at another opportunity that's going to be their own money in 3 years and 5 years and 7 years. Let's not bring them on board. That's even more enticing. But why don't we develop something where you get the first option to be a favorable investor? You get this, you get that. How do you help negotiate that with the family and the talent?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, again, I usually don't see it that boldly put, where it's like, hey, I'll be here for 5 years and then I'm going to raise a fund. But sometimes you do see that up front, but oftentimes it's more just it evolves, mid-cycle, if you will. And then it seems clear that somebody's going to be spinning out. And that's where you do get into negotiations around like staking. So maybe the family takes a piece of the GP and they have favorable terms on co-invest or carry and things like that. And, I would defer a little bit to some of my fund formation lawyers on track record and other things like that. But that is a thing. And I do think sometimes the most successful investment people are eventually going to do their own thing. And the family is lining up to be their anchor investors or stake them or promote them or, this is back to the small world idea. Like, I think burning bridges is never good. And certainly in the world of deal flow and, you see that negotiations start to occur. So that's a big trend. We don't have to dwell on it, but I am seeing more and more, not just individuals or teams spinning out of family offices, but family offices themselves just raising capital. Right? Like just becoming.
It's a huge trend.
Yeah. So that, and I know we've got, the MSD and BDT deal and all things like that, but I do think we're just going to see more and more, mergers with family offices and traditional funds and more registrations of family offices becoming registered advisors and that whole. So yeah, that's a trend that I'm just seeing more and more of all the time for a lot of different reasons, where it's not just spinning out somebody, but just keeping the family office actually intact and basically just raising capital.
Well, I mean, honestly, a part of that is to make the finances enticing to your internal talent. You may need to bring in outside capital.
Right.
Now, we could go really deep on this and it could take up 2 hours on its own. Do they
Right.
really understand what it's like going from your own kitchen to going to owning a restaurant where you need to appease not only clientele, but examiners and all that? You're going to have way more legal ramifications, way more legal and filing paperwork. And honestly, for some families, it may not be worth it. But that does bring up the issue of how you're going to entice great talent, where inevitably they may grow a little bit out of you, but you still want to utilize them and potentially also maybe grow a business and make capital to offset your cost, if not even make money. Those are very tough decisions. Nothing is black and white in that.
They are. And for every one single family offices that registers, there's probably 49 that think about it. And I do think that at the end of the day, it is just that total control, to your kitchen analogy. I was working on a really interesting transaction that would have been sort of a combination of a family office and a private equity fund. And I think the thing that really gave pause to the principals was just having that partner at all, let alone the SEC up in their business. I mean, that is a real issue as well. It's like people don't want the oversight and the compliance, but I think it is more of just this idea that this is my money, and having investors that are unrelated that could sue me, or they just don't. Again, most of them have enough money already to live the life that they want. So what's in it for them to go from 2 to 4 billion? I mean, 2 billion is the answer to my question, but from like a life perspective, I think sometimes they just look at the analysis and say, yeah, maybe we could make more money if we do that or raise capital. But the total analysis would say, let's just stay private, unregistered. And then to your point, if that superstar wants to go and do their own thing, let's back them.
Yeah, I mean, I usually think that ends up being the better answer than let's get into the game. There's lots of competition. You lose out on your patient capital, which is no longer that patient because LPs want their payout. And by the way, if $300 billion family offices randomly decided to all do that, where's the deals going to come from? They're not all going to be successful. Actually, most of them, net of fees, probably won't even be that good. I'm just being honest. The math just tells me this. There's too much money. I'm going to ask a question that we could also spend 2 hours on. You hinted at it before when you mentioned carry, but I think I have to bring it up where you can at least give me the 2 or 3 minute highlight. Is there any difference between what we're talking about on carry, on co-investment, and phantom, depending on if the family office or entity is structured as a C Corp, an S Corp, or an LLC? And to throw another wrench, suppose, like in my case, I also have a holdco. And let's say I have it structured in Wyoming, it's a C Corp, and I actually want to give equity, not just phantom equity. How do I know? And again, I know I'm looking for the impossible 2 or 3 minute answer here. How do I, the gist of this, and this is probably right up your alley, is in structuring and understanding nuances of carry.
Yeah, it is obviously a much longer conversation. But here's what I will say. I mean, the thing about carry and co-invest is it's totally contingent on the actual legal and tax structure of the investments themselves, right? Like if the investments are in an S Corp, you can't give an S Corp, you can't give carry in an S Corp without blowing the S election. If it's in a C Corp, you have to drop it down and do a partnership underneath. So what about if it's in a foundation and half the assets are in a foundation and half are in a taxable? Like you're always, this is, why obviously I have a job, is that you actually have to look at the family office structure, the trust and individual structure, the philanthropic trust structure, the investment entities. And that's honestly sometimes where you do, back to phantom equity, is that the legal structure just doesn't allow for the right carry because there's 76 different trusts, some are offshore, there's a foundation, and you want to give the economic alignment of the whole portfolio, but structurally, you actually can't make carry work. like legally. So you defer back to like a phantom plan, or you can just draft a contract and say, well, it can include the foundation, it can include this, that, trust. But carry and co-invest actually require entity structures that allow that. And sometimes the family system. So yeah, that is a tough question. I do think about it a lot, probably more than any other American. Like how does the family office investment carry structure relate or not to the incentive equity plan? Is the carry encumbered by the lower tier expenses of funds or not? I mean, this is where we could nerd out for hours, but the bottom line is, yeah, you always are starting with what actually exists legally, but a lot of times our projects do involve a reshuffling of investments to facilitate an incentive equity plan for employees. But sometimes, that's just not possible because of regulatory issues or control issues or whatever. We do our best, Angela.
Indeed. I think I'm down to my final three questions because we have a live audience today. You're being a little quiet. If you wanted to type in a question in the chat, I can't guarantee it, but I'm hopeful that we could potentially get to it as we're heading a little bit to the home stretch. A little bit of a sensitive topic. I think we beat around it a little bit in maybe the earlier part of our discussion. I was in a meeting with family office consultants, my peers. Yeah, that was a real exciting meeting. It actually was. Boy, the cigars and drinks were really flowing about 3 years ago. And one of them just like had us rolling on the floor because unfortunately, and a little bit sadly, although it was said in jest, it's true more than it should be. And that is our family offices often in the latter stage of a professional's career, a little bit of the graveyard they go to not work too hard, to be diligent, but not much more than 9 to 5. And why are family offices settling for that? Is it so hard to go and find someone who's more than trustworthy, who's talented and hungry? That's not to say that someone older cannot be hungry, cannot be incredible. I'm an older gentleman. I'm heading into my sixth decade. So, like, I get it. I want to stand up for those of us that are older than the medium of 37. But she was correct in that comment. Sadly, that is true. Even if it's 20% of the time, it should be 0%. Yeah. Why? Why does it happen?
Well, I'm not sure that it happens more in family offices than other enterprises. First of all, I mean, there's certainly a premium to stability, and I think it actually really is sometimes harder to find. It's kind of like the double problem, right, Angelo? Like if you have someone, and I don't want to really weigh in on age issues, but if you have someone that's been there a while, and maybe they don't have the same zest or hunger that they did 20 years before, but you're still having to weigh, okay, well, maybe we go and hire fresh talent, but what if that person isn't great? And what if it takes us 5 years to figure out how not great they are? Where are we? And it's a hard problem. It's a hard problem to solve. So I guess like kind of though, but for the grace of God go I hesitate to critique that just because it's a hard risk to take. And sometimes you don't realize the dynamics. And sometimes even if you do, you still just make a decision like, hey, maybe this is okay. Right? Because what's the point? Like if a family already has incredible wealth and you have a custodian that maybe is not hitting triples and homers, but is doing well, and and believe that they're acting in the family's best interest and they're trustworthy and they're really seeing risk for what it is, like maybe that's okay. But I don't want to criticize. I just think it's a hard problem to solve, and I do think maybe it happens, but I think you're taking a risk either way. And sometimes you're just living with someone that's more stable, even if they don't have hunger or zest or whatever you want to say. Maybe that's a better option than gambling years trying to find the superstar that may or may not exist.
My final two questions are not really specifically comp centric, but they're overall important, I think, to or maybe just fun for me in our conversation. One Angeloism is you you don't really have a how problem, you have a who problem, and that is putting the burden on basically incredible people are incredible. You don't think that Einstein, Elon, all the amazing people I can mention can't solve a lot of problems? Sure, they could.
Right.
So my question, and meant to be a little comical but serious, and this relates a little bit to people like you and the before mentioned Steve Thorne, is families often really need problem solvers. Problems are infinite. There will always be problems. Greater money, probably even big. Well, I know from experience and working with, like you, so many families, it does bring problems. So, how I'm going to tie this together, I'm sure you're at least familiar with the former TV show Suits about the legal firm. There was the character Harvey Specter that was the lead character. Yes, he was an attorney. Yes, he pushed the boundaries probably more than once. I never really looked at Harvey as being an attorney's attorney. I looked at Harvey as, I want you to make my problems go away, a problem solver. Yeah. So how should family offices look at their CEO or president or even outside people like you? Forget the technical part. Do you help solve problems?
Yeah, I guess if I wanted to summarize my whole job description, I think it's that. Like, to me, if you raise a problem without solutions, that's worthless. So I think the job of all of us in this ecosystem is to identify opportunities, but also to react quickly and creatively to solving problems. That's the whole shoot and match. I mean, I have clients that I don't even say we have a problem. I've already thought about 3 solutions, and that's what I present. I mean, I don't present problems without solutions. That's not a thing. So I do think that is like a hallmark of, let's say, a non-investment executive. Like, that's what they're really good at, knowing what they don't know, knowing when to solve it themselves quickly, knowing when to bring in other people. But yeah, I think that is the main job, I think, of main executives, is really tackling problems and being creative in solutions and never focusing on the problem. Just figure it out.
And
that's sort of what I think. I mean, I almost think
love
there's
it.
no problem we can't solve. Like, I think, the question is not, we can't solve it. It's like, well, maybe we can't exactly solve it in this way, but what about that? And I do think that's why, good advisors know that that's their currency, is thinking creatively about problem solving.
Well, Patrick, we're using a lot of sports metaphors here. I'm going to use another one. This one is coming out of left field. If you had to go into this discussion with me, thinking about a question that Angelo would not ask or not even think of, this is probably it. But I'm interested in it from you being a partner in a legal firm. My audience knows I did a little program yesterday that I called the Detroit Paradox. It's built on Detroit in the 60s saw the Japanese auto industry coming, but they elected through arrogance, hubris, to effectively ignore it. Let's wait till next year. And then inevitably, especially with the oil embargo and smaller cars and efficiencies, it bit them in the butt. I go to Silicon Valley all the time. I'm very active in the world of exponential technologies and AI. And I did something on a variation of AI called AI agents. And my thought about partnership arrangements like legal and accounting firms and consulting firms, and I'm probably putting you in a little bit of a tough spot here.
Nice.
It's very obvious to me that those firms are going to look to enhance profitability in a tougher and tougher world. Therefore, associates, often some of them aren't really that good. They could call in sick. They could do things in the office that get me in legal trouble. I think we all know what that could mean without me mentioning it. We're humans. Mistakes happen. Therefore, if I could save on the frustration and cost of associates with advancements in AI and AI agents reading 10,000 pages of legal text and giving me an answer I'm making this up a little bit, in 3 seconds. Is the future of professional service firms going to get very limited at the top, less people in general, and the impact of technology, AI, and what I call, and the industry calls, AI agents? And how does that circle back to even professional organizations like family offices?
Boy, what do we have? 36 seconds for that one?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely at McDermott think about that a ton. Like and I'm not as deep as others, but we have a very deep commitment to just acknowledging, we're not trying to build faster horses, as they say. Like, we're accepting and embracing this technology. I think there is a perception among some of us that this is, it's going to be a sea change, that legal services or accounting is going to be completely different in 10 years, 5, whatever you think the horizon is. I mean, I guess I think of it as, well, what I do and what a lot of lawyers do anyway, is strategy. And it's not just packaging and repackaging information, right? It's like taking information and making strategic moves with it, but they're moves that are not chess moves. They're moves that require a lot of deep understanding of markets and human nature. And maybe AI can figure all that out. I really don't know. But I guess I always think that there's going to be a role. But to your point, maybe it is more the associate class is just different. But then how do you become a senior person? So you get into that problem of like, no one can become a senior strategic lawyer or accountant or family office person without learning. And so you're going to have a learning problem at some point. And I just don't think AI is going to be able to replace deep legal structuring and strategies. But I do think you'll be able to like put every purchase agreement that's ever been written in a large language model and like spit out, like, I think corporate transactions are going to be totally different. And there's just going to be a lot less paper flying. And I think maybe more efficient ways to just get at agreed terms and things like that. But maybe I'm being naive, but I do think there's always going to be a role for problem solvers. But yeah, I think that professional service firms are already changing in real time. But I do think that maybe that junior class or whatever you want to call it might essentially be replaced. But I can't then solve for, the only reason I got to learn is that I went through those paces. So I'm not sure how you're going to skip over that step and become a more advanced strategist without every step. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure where it's going to land, but I do think that if you're not on top of it, back to your point of the Detroit automakers, if you're in denial about that technology or not open to working with it, I think you're going to be toast.
And I'm going to reiterate that. Maybe even I'll double down on it. That key word from your mouth, not mine, toast, is 100% correct. My timeline might be a little off. Okay, maybe it's not 12 or 24 months from now. I promise you it's not 10 or 20 years from now. It's somewhere that's in a relatively foreseeable future, which is why I asked before that the question about the fictitious character Harvey Specter from Suits, a problem solver. And then I think you're safe for, I don't know, 3 to 10 years if you keep on working on it. But eventually with AGI and superintelligence, I think it may come down to, I simply want a human, I trust the human to be the overseer. But now I have $1 billion family office and I have 1 or 2 people. It's going to get very competitive for those opportunities. And what's the skill set that you're necessarily going to need to have and will adapt in the coming years? And henceforth, that's a big part of what I do, which is a little different at SFO Continuity. But more important than that, Patrick, I took enough of your time. For those that are interested in following up, learning more, and reaching out, how could they do so?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you can link to, my email or website, but if you go to McDermott Will Emery and put in my name, feel free to just, my contact information's on there, or you can ask Angelo to introduce us directly, or however people want to, you can find me, and happy to talk to anybody about, anything we talked about or other topics. With always looking to expand our network and McDermott, not to be too much of a promoter, but we've got some really great conferences for single family offices. You don't have to be a McDermott client. So happy to talk to anybody about some of those. Some of them are investment focused, some of them are more broader topics, but happy to just introduce people into our conference sessions and things like that as well.
And I'll give a little bit of a close here, Patrick. And by the way, Patrick's last name is spelt McCurry. And if you simply just Google him, it'll pull up McDermott Will Emery. And like all legal firms, it has the button where you could click and get contact info with phone number and email. For my members specifically, you could definitely reach out to me, and I'm happy to make a more warm and a personal intro. I was really looking forward to doing something on compensation for a long time and to actually do something with Patrick. So it's been a little bit softly 2 or 3 years in the making. Finally, we got it done. And again, many of you may be familiar with Patrick for his incredible overall work with family office structuring, the dynamics around that, and around certain unique things from investing, including really significant families and maybe some less so, and the nuances now of LP interest in sports teams, how GPs could invest in the NFL through private equity funds. These are all things that will have Patrick and or other people from the team on a little bit later in the year. But highly recommended reaching out to Patrick, or at least, especially as a member, connecting with me. From my perspective, everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. Some of you know me in the old days as the founder and multi-decade CEO of Family Office Association, sold it, have my own family office, love to invest, very active investor, but I really missed being in the game. So for me, my interviews on at Family Office on YouTube, some of them after the fact, YouTube or LinkedIn, I share, but my members always get immediate access, immediate interaction, the direct opportunity for me to make intros to speakers, and all the digital, private digital, and in-person programs and original master classes and thought leadership that I host. Compensation is a very, very important topic. And the latter questions that I asked Patrick around creative thinking, critical thinking, and basically problem solving, and the world of AI and AI agents. Honestly, I don't see anyone else in the family office world of any intellectual capacity and deep connectivity that's talking about it. If you want to be on the cutting edge, go to angelorobles.com. Honestly, join, become a member, learn more, be a charter member in terms of what I'm building, and I think you'll get value. But if that's not your cup of tea, I give more than enough amazing content, I hope, around LinkedIn, X, and YouTube. And consider me a friend and have the opportunity to reach out. Patrick, again, thank you for all your time.
Thank you, Angelo. It was great. Great talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good one. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.